He walked onto the plane with silence in his stride, just another passenger with a first-class boarding pass. But by the time Flight 283 landed, he had grounded every jet in the airline's fleet. Why did the crew question his presence in seat 1A when no one questioned the man next to him? Why did the passengers fall silent until one woman, a stranger, finally stood up? And who was this man? Really? What the crew didn't know was that they weren't dealing with just another traveler. They had humiliated the one man with the power to freeze their entire operation in midair. And he did it without yelling, without fighting, just by refusing to shrink. This isn't just a story about racism on a plane. It's a story about what happens when dignity becomes non-negotiable. What would you do if the sky itself refused to lift off until justice came first? Stay with us, because what unfolds next might just change how you see every boarding gate forever. If you believe in dignity, justice, and powerful storytelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's begin. The quiet hum of cabin air whispered above his head, a dull backdrop to the tension blooming between rows 1 and 2. He hadn't said much, hadn't needed to. He was already sitting, already buckled in, already holding the small handwritten boarding pass that said plainly, Seat 1A, First Class, Quinton Raye. But now, standing above him, arms crossed with the practiced patience of someone used to being obeyed, was a flight attendant named Tricia Coleman. Her polite smile no longer reached her eyes. "Sir," she said for the second time, "we'll need to move you to another seat." There was a last-minute change. The gentleman behind you has priority status, and we've had to make some quick adjustments. Quinton blinked slowly. His hands remained on his lap. He turned his head, just slightly, toward the man now standing in the aisle, a white man in his late 30s, tailored navy blazer, slicked back blonde hair, wireless earbuds in one hand, smug detachment in the other. That man didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His presence spoke louder than any explanation. "I'm already seated," Quinton replied quietly. Tricia's smile faltered. "Yes, but we'll provide a travel voucher for the inconvenience. The seat just came open in 14C. It's an exit row. Still very comfortable." "I booked seat 1A," he said again, calmly, "and I'm not moving." Passengers around them began to take notice. A few glanced up from their phones. One man across the aisle turned down the volume on his podcast. A woman in 2B slowly tilted her head to listen, her eyes flicking between Quinton and the flight attendant. There was no raised voice, no threat, no drama, just a subtle tension building like pressurized air in a sealed cabin. Tricia straightened her posture. "Sir, I need you to comply with our seating procedures. The aircraft cannot depart until all passengers are properly seated." Quinton remained still. In his mind, a door had already opened, a different kind of door. Not the overhead bin kind, the internal kind, the kind that remembered 1,000 moments just like this one, moments sharpened by microaggressions dressed up as policy. The kind that never made the news, but sat buried deep in the bones of black men like him who had climbed too high to be invisible, yet somehow still were. He didn't move, didn't reach for his boarding pass, didn't raise his voice, just looked at her and said softly, "This is my assigned seat." The man behind him, Derek Voss, let out a soft, amused chuckle. "It's fine," he said casually. "I'm not trying to make a big deal, just trying to get where I'm going. I paid for an upgrade. That's all." The way he said it, "I paid for an upgrade," was laced with assumption. As if Quinton hadn't. As if first class was something he'd accidentally stumbled into. A clerical error, soon to be corrected. Tricia turned toward the front of the cabin, gestured subtly. A second flight attendant approached. He looked younger, more unsure of himself. She whispered something, and the man nodded, disappearing into the cockpit. Quinton closed his eyes for a moment. He could feel it coming, the familiar pull of conflict. The choice. Make a scene, or let it go. Show restraint, or show resistance. His pulse remained calm, but somewhere beneath it, a different rhythm stirred. Not anger, not yet. Strategy. As the younger flight attendant returned, he leaned in toward Tricia and whispered something hurriedly. She looked briefly flustered, then forced another smile. "Mr. Raye," she said, "this isn't personal. It's just a last-minute adjustment. Please understand we're doing our best to accommodate everyone." "You're accommodating everyone," Quinton said, eyes steady on hers. "But me," that sentence sat in the air for a moment, unmoving, undeniable. And then he reached, slowly, into his coat pocket, not for a boarding pass or wallet, but for a small matte black device, no larger than a phone. He pressed one button. The screen lit up with a single line of text. "Authenticate." His thumb hovered. He didn't press it. Not yet. The cabin door was still open. Passengers were still settling. But in a few moments, that would change. And when it did, when that door sealed and the aircraft became its own sovereign space, subject to FAA protocols, so would everything else. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be closing the cabin door shortly. Please take your seats and store all personal belongings in the overhead bins or under the seat in front of you." Quinton said nothing. He was already seated. Derek Voss cleared his throat behind him, clearly growing impatient. "Sir," Tricia tried one last time, her voice almost a whisper now, "if you don't move voluntarily, I may have to call airport security to assist." Quinton looked at her deeply this time. Past the uniform, past the plastic badge, past the smile she wore like armor. And in that quiet, in that breath between confrontation and consequence, he spoke the sentence that would, hours later, appear on headlines across the country. "I'm not moving." The younger flight attendant hesitated. Tricia blinked. Behind her, a child in 1C looked up from her tablet and whispered to her mother, "Is he in trouble?" The mother gently shook her head. "No," she said. "He's just not giving up his seat." And in that moment, in that small refusal, that quiet line in the sand, a shift began. Not a loud one, not explosive, but real. The kind that changes things, not just for one man, but for everyone watching. Because sometimes, revolution doesn't look like shouting. Sometimes, it looks like staying seated. The floor of Portfield International reflected the overcast Oregon sky above, casting a pale light through the terminal's wide glass panels. The concourse buzzed with quiet urgency, the clatter of wheeled suitcases, the rustle of boarding passes, the soft murmurs of families, business travelers, and restless toddlers. Quinton Raye moved through it all like still water. No entourage, no assistants trailing behind him, no custom-tailored suit or loud designer emblems to announce his presence. He wore a well-fitted charcoal coat, a black button-down shirt beneath it, and plain slacks. His leather duffel bag bore scuff marks on the edges, real wear, not curated fashion. He liked to travel light. He liked to travel alone. As he walked through Terminal C, he passed a Virion Air billboard stretching across the corridor wall. The tagline beneath its shimmering photo of a flight attendant smiling in first class read, "Everyone deserves to feel elevated." He slowed down for a moment and studied the slogan. He knew the agency that had designed it. His own firm, Raye Vector Technologies, had helped draft the compliance language tied to the campaign. It was supposed to be a step forward, a public-facing commitment to equity, dignity, and safety in air travel. And yet, even the most polished words couldn't reach the rust that grew deeper down. He resumed walking. 44 minutes before takeoff, he reached Gate C-18. The boarding area was unusually quiet for a weekday. A few corporate types typed quickly into their phones. A couple in their 60s huddled over a crossword puzzle. And one young man, hoodie up, earbuds in, slept with his mouth open, curled against his backpack like a cat against a radiator. Quinton stepped to the side, pulling out his phone. The matte black screen shimmered once as it unlocked to a custom interface. No apps, no browser. Just a single word at the center. Centrac. The system was his, built in silence, deployed in shadows, approved through a quiet partnership with the Department of Transportation and the FAA. Its job wasn't flashy. It wasn't designed to stop hijackings or scan luggage. It didn't look for weapons. It looked for patterns, discrimination, disparities in treatment, access, enforcement, passive hostility, microaggressions, cultural bias hidden behind protocol. Centrac collected data from real-time flights, ticket scans, seating assignments, and behavior modeling. But it still needed one thing that no machine could simulate: human presence. And that's why Quinton was here, traveling without an alias, without a press team, without advance notice. Not as CEO, not as a nameplate on a federal brief, but as a passenger. His role in the Centrac program wasn't widely known. Only a handful of people, even within his own company, had full visibility. Miranda Cho, his lead systems analyst, had tried to convince him not to personally audit the flagged routes, but he insisted, always insisted, because he knew the problem wasn't just statistical, it was lived. Portfield to Marston, Flight 228, Viren Air. This route had been flagged twice in the past year, not because of safety issues or passenger complaints, but because of how often passengers of color in first class had been reassigned, questioned, or delayed without cause. Nothing ever made headlines. No viral videos. Just data points, quiet ones, too quiet to ignore. Boarding Group 1. The gate agent called. First class and active military may board at this time. Quinton stepped forward and handed over his boarding pass. The young agent scanned it. Her smile faltered for half a second, eyes flicking up to him, then back to the screen. He noticed it, not the smile itself, but the pause, the second guess. As if waiting for the scanner to beep twice. It didn't. Just one clean chime. "Enjoy your flight," she said, returning his pass. He nodded, quietly. As he walked down the jet bridge, his mind drifted again back to the summer of 1992. The year his father passed. The year everything changed. He had been 14 then. The world was smaller, colder. His father, a retired systems engineer and Vietnam vet, had once told him, "Power doesn't mean being the loudest voice in the room. It means being the one they still hear after you've left." He carried that lesson the way some men carry knives close, always ready. He'd needed it, especially in boardrooms where the air turned thick the moment he walked in, especially in interviews where his credentials were double-checked, especially in airports like this, inside the cabin. Quinton found his seat 1A waiting quietly, a window view, enough legroom to stretch fully. He sat down slowly, adjusting the strap on his watch, which had just buzzed with a new notification. Centrac note initialized. Monitoring behavior Delta. He tapped once to acknowledge. He wasn't sure what he expected. He never boarded flights hoping for conflict. He boarded hoping it wasn't needed, that systems would hold, that people would behave better than the data predicted. But deep down, he knew better. He reached into his duffel and pulled out a small worn leather notebook. Inside were names, moments, notes from every audit he'd ever done, silent stories of people who'd been displaced, disregarded, dishonored. One entry stood out from last year. A black woman in Detroit, pulled from first class because a male executive had urgent status. Her name was Clarissa. She'd emailed him later that month, thanking him for not just listening, but following through. He kept her thank you note tucked in the back pocket of the book. Now, seated in 1A. Quinton let his hand rest on the page. No reason. Just something to ground him. The hum of boarding continued. A child passed by, tugging her suitcase. A couple argued quietly about overhead bin space. A teenager fumbled with his backpack and accidentally bumped his seat. Quinton gave a polite smile. The boy muttered, "Sorry, man," and moved on. It was ordinary, unremarkable. For now. Then came the voice. "Excuse me, sir," which said. He looked up and saw her blonde hair tied back, uniform crisp, name tag reading Tricia. She was smiling, but her posture was already defensive. "Sorry to bother you," she continued, "but it looks like we've had a seating issue. May I see your boarding pass?" And just like that, the quiet cracked. Not loud, not breaking, just the first splinter. He reached into his coat and handed it to her. She looked at it, then back at him. He waited. She said, glancing behind her. "Okay, just stay seated a moment. Please, I'll be right back." Quinton nodded. Outside, through the oval window. The tarmac shimmered faintly in the Portland drizzle, but inside the cabin, something colder had begun to stir. A pattern, and he knew exactly what came next. The seat cushion beneath Quinton Raye felt suddenly stiff. He shifted his weight slightly, more from instinct than discomfort. Outside the cabin window, the runway lights began to blink in a slow, steady rhythm, like eyes opening and closing. Inside, the energy was changing. Tricia Coleman returned, this time with a different posture. No longer a flight attendant asking for clarification now. She was carrying the manufactured confidence of someone who believed she had the upper hand. "Mr. Raye," she said. "I just double-checked with our gate system. There appears to have been an internal reassignment. I'll need to ask you to relocate to seat 14C. It's an exit row. Very spacious." Quinton didn't flinch. "And what happened to my seat?" Her tone remained bright. "It was reallocated for a last-minute upgrade to one of our premium passengers. I understand this is inconvenient, and I'm happy to offer a $150 travel voucher for the trouble." He leaned forward slightly, clasping his hands in front of him. "You're asking me to leave a seat I paid for," he said. "The one that was assigned to me when I booked, that I boarded with." "Because someone else showed up," Tricia hesitated. "Just a flicker. That gentleman is one of our highest-tier Virion Elite members. We try to accommodate their upgrades whenever possible." Quinton's voice was low and measured. "So was I randomly selected to be moved." She swallowed. "It's nothing personal." But of course it was. The moment felt stretched, like two strings being pulled in opposite directions, one of politeness, one of principle. "Mr. Voss is waiting," she added, glancing toward the aisle. Derek Voss was still standing near the galley, arms crossed, a subtle smirk on his face. He didn't speak, didn't step forward. His posture was relaxed, entitled, as if he had already decided how this would end. Quinton studied him. It wasn't just about a seat. It was about what the seat represented. Dignity, visibility, belonging. And once again, he was being asked to surrender that quietly, politely, under the disguise of routine procedure. Tricia shifted again. We really need to begin departure protocols. May I help you gather your belongings? Quinton slowly opened his duffel bag. He removed his small leather notebook, placing it on his lap. Then, he lifted the matte black Centrac device and turned it slightly toward her, not to intimidate, not to provoke, but to mark this moment. Tricia blinked. Sir, is that a phone? No, he replied. It's a recording node, and it just started logging. She stepped back, unsure whether to escalate or retreat. Passengers were watching now. The atmosphere had grown tight, subtle. Invisible wires of attention stretched between rows. People didn't want to look, but they couldn't not look. Quinton took a breath. He thought of his father again, how the man had taught him not to fight every battle with fire, but never to surrender quietly when the terms of dignity were on the line. I will not be moving, he said. If this aircraft cannot accommodate me in the seat I paid for, then I'm afraid we have a different problem. Sir, she said, I'm just doing my job. No, he replied gently. You're doing someone else's bidding? The words landed softly, but with weight. Tricia stepped away. Her headset clicked on. She whispered something under her breath and turned down the aisle. Across the cabin, a mother adjusted her baby's carrier against her chest. A teenage boy looked up from his game and subtly removed one earbud. A businessman in 1B cleared his throat and opened a newspaper, pretending not to listen. Quinton didn't move, not because he wanted to prove anything, but because he needed to make this moment visible, because no system changes until someone refuses to vanish. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, a new figure appeared, stocky, square-jawed, wearing the insignia of a gate supervisor. His badge read Dennis Cleary. His tie was too short for his frame. He walked up, leaned slightly forward, and spoke in a calm but firm voice. Mr. Raye, I'm Dennis, one of the gate leads. I understand there's been a misunderstanding about your seating. No misunderstanding, Quinton said. Just a misjudgment. Cleary offered a rehearsed smile. Sir, we value all of our passengers, but I need to inform you that if you refuse to comply with crew instructions, you may be removed from this aircraft. Are you removing me because I violated policy? Quinton asked. No, Cleary admitted. Because you refused to switch seats when asked. I was asked to move from my assigned seat to accommodate someone else. That's not refusal to comply. That's refusal to be displaced. Cleary rubbed the back of his neck. It's not personal. It's just how the upgrade system works. Quinton held up the Centrac device again. Would you like to see how many people this has happened to in the past year? I could pull the analytics right now. Cleary froze, unsure what to say. Tricia returned, now visibly flustered. Sir, at this point. But before she could finish, another voice entered the cabin. Is there an issue here? It was Miranda Cho, not on the manifest, not in uniform, not even supposed to be there. But she was. The co-founder of Raye Vector Technologies had quietly booked a ticket on the same flight. She had entered unnoticed, sat several rows back, but the moment had arrived. She stepped forward, pulling out her own ID. I'd like to speak to the captain. Tricia's mouth opened slightly. You're with the FAA, no, Miranda said. But I am with the man you're trying to remove. And I suggest you stop what you're doing before this airline finds itself in federal hearings. Silence. Even Derek Voss blinked. Let me be very clear, Miranda continued. The man sitting in 1A is not only a passenger. He is a federal systems auditor, operating under government partnership for bias detection within commercial aviation. Every word you've said since he boarded has been recorded. Every decision you've made is now part of a live compliance review." Trisha's face paled. Quinton said nothing. He didn't have to. Miranda turned to him. "You good?" He nodded once. "For now." Cleary stepped back. I wasn't aware." "That's the point," Miranda replied. "You weren't supposed to be." Passengers were staring. Phones were out. The quiet tension had given way to something more electric now. Uncertainty. Shame. Awareness. Miranda turned and walked to the back of the plane again, blending into the rows like she had never spoken. Quinton looked once more out the window. The drizzle had faded. The runway glowed. The gate agent's voice crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our final preparations for departure. Please remain seated." Trisha returned to the front of the cabin. She didn't say another word. Quinton reached for his notebook. Inside, he wrote down one sentence. "They always ask nicely, right before they try to erase you." Then he closed the book and waited for the wheels to leave the ground. The cabin door hissed shut with a finality that made everyone flinch just slightly. The overhead lights dimmed, signaling the beginning of pre-flight checks. The mood on board remained taut, not loud or chaotic, but a kind of collective stillness that followed the echo of exposed tension. Quinton Raye sat quietly in seat 1A, his hands folded over the small leather-bound notebook on his lap. Outside the window, the airport ground crew moved like slow shadows against the shimmer of runway fog. Inside, the aircraft was sealed both physically and symbolically. He leaned his head back against the seat, letting out a long breath. The moment of confrontation was over. The moment of consequence had arrived. From the outside, nothing about him looked out of place. A well-dressed man in first class, window seat, quietly waiting for takeoff. But inside that calm, a silent storm had already begun, one not of vengeance or anger, but of accountability, and it was time. Quinton reached slowly into his coat and retrieved the matte black Centrac device. His thumb hovered over the corner button, then pressed down and held for 3 seconds. The screen lit up, displaying one simple option: initiate protocol code, silent keystone. He tapped yes. There was no fanfare, no alert, no blinking lights or sounds, just one quiet confirmation. Federal Oversight Channel, initiated Flight 228, tagged immediate hold sequence global dispatch, triggered central link node locked and secured. He placed the device on the tray table in front of him. A soft vibration pulsed through it once, then again, and stopped. Then he waited, across the aisle. A businessman in 1B adjusted his tie nervously, clearly still processing the earlier exchange. His eyes darted once toward Quinton, but quickly flicked away when Quinton met his gaze. No words, just unease. Behind him, in row 2D, Miranda Cho sat with her knees crossed and a paperback novel open in her hands. She wasn't reading. She was listening, waiting, watching. 12 minutes passed. Then Quinton's tray table lit up again. This time, it wasn't the Centrac device. It was the plane's communication system. The intercom crackled overhead, and the voice of the pilot came through steady, professional, and slightly confused. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reardon speaking. I've just been informed of a procedural update from air traffic control. We're currently being held at gate due to a system-wide dispatch halt affecting multiple routes. We ask for your patience as we await further instructions. Estimated delay time currently unknown." A ripple of murmurs swept through the cabin. Passengers began glancing at one another, confused. A few took out their phones to check flight tracking apps. One woman muttered something under her breath about missing a connection. But Quinton said nothing. He simply closed his eyes and listened. Miranda smiled quietly. Centrac had worked. The code's silent keystone override protocol was designed for moments like this, rare, but necessary. In its most discreet function, it allowed FAA-linked auditors to freeze high-risk airline operations if discriminatory practices were observed and confirmed during live flight audits. The system required more than anecdotal reports. It needed algorithmic confirmation, pattern validation, and human corroboration. Today, all three had aligned. The delay wasn't just a delay. It was a silent indictment. As Virion Air's flight systems began to freeze across dispatch towers, compliance teams were notified through encrypted channels. FAA monitors began reviewing flight patterns and audit logs. Within minutes, the situation would escalate to a boardroom far above this cabin. But for now, the passengers remained unaware. Only Quinton and Miranda knew what was unfolding. The pilot's voice returned. Ladies and gentlemen, we've just received updated information that Virion's central dispatch system is temporarily offline. We're awaiting a response from operations. We appreciate your patience. In the galley. Tricia Coleman stood stiffly, gripping a tablet she wasn't reading. She had tried to reset her expression into something neutral, but her hands trembled just slightly as she typed aimlessly. She had seen Miranda's badge. She had overheard just enough to realize this was not going away quietly, and Derek Voss, the hedge fund executive who had expected his upgrade to be honored without question, had now been reassigned back to seat 14C. He sat with his arms folded tightly, tapping one foot and scowling toward the front of the plane. He was not used to waiting. He was even less used to losing. Quinton opened his notebook again. He didn't need to write anything down, but his hand moved anyway out of ritual, out of stillness. He sketched a line across the page, then another, building a kind of abstract web. Not words, not diagrams, just lines, motion, presence, thought. He thought of the woman named Clarissa again, the one displaced from her seat last year, and he thought of the dozens before her whose stories had never made it past a complaint form buried in customer service queues. This moment was for them. This moment was also for himself. He had worked too long to build silent systems of justice that never got noticed. He had worn the calm face too many times. Watch people smile while erasing him with the language of just doing my job. Not today. Not anymore. The Centrac device vibrated again. Miranda glanced at hers too. A quiet ping confirmed what they both expected. Virion Operational Integrity. Under Review Board Inquiry. Set 14 minutes CEO alert. Triggered network freeze in effect. 43 airports. Quinton closed his notebook. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up, and stretched slightly, not in defiance, but with presence, the kind that can't be ignored. Tricia looked up from the galley. Their eyes met. She said nothing. Quinton reached into the overhead bin, retrieved a small thermos of tea he had packed, poured himself a cup, and sat back down slowly. The moment didn't need words. The moment was already speaking for itself. Passengers were growing restless. The businessman next to him leaned over. "Do you know what's going on? This kind of thing never happens on Virion." Quinton offered a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes, things have to stop so we can see them clearly." The man blinked. That's supposed to mean something. Quinton took a slow sip of tea. Eventually, it will. Miranda leaned back in her seat behind him, eyes closed now, head resting against the cabin wall. She knew what was coming. Within the next hour, Virion's leadership team would be in a scramble. Their elite members would begin calling for explanations. Journalists would catch wind of a system-wide disruption, and buried inside those quiet lines of code and audit data would be a moment they couldn't ignore. A black man, in seat 1A, told to move for someone else. And that man had said no. At exactly 6:42 p.m. Eastern Time, a conference call snapped open across 5 time zones. The screen inside Viren Air's Central Operations Hub in Dallas blinked on with 5 rectangular faces, each one sharp, polished, unnerved. "I want to know," barked Garrett Langston, Virion's chief operating officer, "who the hell authorized a system-wide dispatch freeze on a peak route flight? And I want to know 10 minutes ago. Around the room." No one answered at first. Screens continued blinking red. Amber Dupree, Director of Legal Risk and Compliance, spoke next. "The freeze wasn't internal. We were locked out from the FAA side. The override came through a quiet access Tier 1 clearance. It's legit." Langston's jaw tensed. "We haven't had a Tier 1 override since that incident in Minneapolis. That level's only supposed to activate when there's a major federal breach." "It's been activated," Amber said, "under code Silent Keystone. And whoever did it, they're on Flight 228 to Dulles." The silence inside the boardroom was so sharp it could have drawn blood. In the background, more dispatch screens showed dozens of blinking aircraft icons frozen mid-gate, while a handful in air were being diverted or delayed from landing clearances. This wasn't a technical failure. This was a quiet lockdown, strategic, precise, federal. "Who's on that flight?" Langston demanded. "What triggered it?" "We ran the manifest," said Colin Reyes, head of passenger relations. "The only name flagged under classified systems is a Quinton Raye. I had to cross-reference through Centrac's encrypted logs just to confirm." Langston frowned. "Never heard of him." Amber looked up slowly from her tablet. "I have," she said. "He's the CEO of Ray Vector Technologies." Another pause. "The AI Logistics Group?" Langston asked. "No. The AI and federal compliance contractor. Ray Vector's the firm that built the Centrac enforcement platform for the Department of Transportation 3 years ago. He's not just a CEO, he's the author of the compliance system we signed on to." Langston's voice lowered, suddenly cautious. "You're telling me the man we just tried to displace is the man who built the system that's now locking us down?" Amber nodded once. "Oh, God," muttered someone on the other end of the call. Langston rubbed his eyes. "Someone tell me what happened on that damn plane." Back on Flight 228, the aircraft hadn't moved an inch. 37 minutes since the doors had closed, and passengers were growing anxious. A father in row 9 bounced a fussy toddler on his lap. A couple near the exit row quietly argued about missing a dinner reservation. Someone had already started filming discreetly from their lap. And in the front cabin, Quinton Raye sat like a still point in a swirling storm. He didn't fidget, didn't speak, just sat, eyes calm, observing. He knew how this would go. The initial confusion would give way to irritation. That irritation would turn into curiosity, then scrutiny, and then when the pieces began to align, shame. Because this wasn't just about a flight delay. This was about how easy it had become to erase someone. To see a black man in a first-class seat and assume he didn't belong. To prioritize a frequent flyer over fairness. To rationalize bias behind policies and passenger tiers. But not today. Today, the silence was the protest, and the silence was about to break. His Centrac device buzzed again. Miranda leaned forward from her seat. "How bad is it?" Quinton tilted the screen toward her. 3 airports frozen. 29 flights suspended. 11 redirected. She gave a low whistle. "They're going to panic. They already are." He took another slow sip from his thermos. Across the cabin, Tricia Coleman finally approached again. Her face was no longer neutral. She looked like someone who'd just been caught trespassing in her own home. "Mr. Raye," she said, carefully, "would you care for something to eat? We can begin beverage and meal service while we wait." It was a peace offering, or perhaps an apology without form. He gave a small nod. "I'll take the meal. Thank you." She lingered a second longer. I didn't know who you were," she added, more quietly. Quinton didn't look up. "That's the point." She opened her mouth to say something else, then closed it again and walked away. A subtle hush fell over the cabin again. But it was no longer the hush of routine airline silence. It was something else. Reckoning in 14C. Derek Voss tapped furiously on his phone, trying to reach someone at his firm who might know how to fix this. But the service was spotty, and none of the names in his contact list held any power in this particular fight. He looked up toward the front again. That man, that face, that seat. It still bothered him. Some part of Derek was still convinced this was a misunderstanding, a fluke, but another part, the part he didn't want to admit, had begun to understand. He had just tried to upend the wrong man, and now the whole machine had stopped turning. Back in the boardroom at Virion headquarters, Langston stepped away from the camera feed and faced his leadership team. "We need to issue a pre-statement," he barked. "If this goes public, it's already going public," Amber said. "Social media tags have picked up video from inside Flight 228. And," she turned her tablet toward him, "one of our own junior analysts just leaked an internal memo about the Tier 1 override." Langston's face blanched. "Damage control. Now." Colin cleared his throat. "Garrett, there's more." Langston turned slowly. "We just received a direct Centrac transcript from the device node on 228. It says federal inquiry requested. Documented patterns of discretionary seating displacement under Title Mine-C Bias Screening Initiative. Flight 228 marked for evidence capture." Langston slumped into the chair. It was official now. Not just a disruption. Not just an incident. A federal inquiry. A documented civil rights violation. A visible, traceable moment embedded into FAA systems. Recorded through a device built by the very man they had just tried to relocate. On board. The meal carts rolled slowly down the aisle. Quinton unfolded the napkin across his lap and accepted the tray without a word. Miranda leaned forward behind him. "You sure you want to go all the way with this?" she asked softly. He nodded. "I didn't come here to be seen," he said. "I came here to see who they really were." Miranda paused. "And now they see you." "No," he said. "Now they see themselves." Outside the plane, rain had started to fall, just a light mist, brushing against the fuselage. But inside, something deeper was shifting. The kind of storm that couldn't be measured in turbulence. The kind that changed flight paths. The flight cabin remained grounded, locked in a strange kind of limbo. Not airborne, not moving, not canceled, just still. Outside, the airport tarmac had darkened with the setting sun, casting a soft reflection on the fuselage. Inside, it was as if time had stretched. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting. And then it happened. Phones buzzed. All at once, as if orchestrated by some invisible hand. The glow of screens lit up across the cabin. Notifications, headlines, and breaking news alerts rolled in like a wave. First, breaking multiple. Virion flights. Delayed nationwide. Federal inquiry suspected. Then FAA halts Virion operations after Tier 1 audit override. Then Black CEO reportedly denied seat on Flight 228 flight now grounded. It took less than 4 seconds for heads to start turning. Row 12, Row 8, Row 3. All eyes gradually shifting toward the front, toward the man in 1A. Still, quiet, hands calmly resting on his lap. The businessman beside Quinton turned his phone slightly, showing him a screen. "Is this?" Quinton nodded. Miranda sat up straighter behind him, scrolling through trending tags. "You're on every screen in the country," she whispered. Someone in the cabin said it out loud, half in awe, half in shock. "That's him. He's the one. That's the guy from the article." Tricia, still in the galley, peeked around the partition. She saw the shifting eyes. She saw the screens. And then she saw Quinton Raye. No longer a mystery passenger in a suit, but a man who had just made the entire airline industry pause. Her hands trembled. She backed away, farther back, in 14C. Derek Voss clenched his phone so tightly the case cracked at the corner. His face had gone a full shade paler. He wasn't reading anymore. He was calculating. This was beyond an incident. This was a national headline. In the cockpit, Captain Reardon received the update through secure dispatch. "Do not proceed with departure. Continue hold. FAA investigation underway. Await direct instructions." He leaned back in his seat, eyes darting toward the flight data screen. "Holy hell," he muttered. Meanwhile, Quinton opened his own phone, not for the headlines, but for one notification in particular. A text from his younger sister. "Ava, I just saw you on CNN. I'm crying. You're making history." Quietly, just like always. He closed his eyes. That's not why he did it, but he understood why it mattered. The girl in 3D was the first to speak. She looked to be in her late 20s, an art teacher maybe, with wide eyes and a soft voice. "Excuse me," she said, turning toward Quinton. "Is it true, what they're saying, that they tried to move you for someone else?" Quinton turned to face her. "Yes," he said calmly, "they did. And you refused. I had the right to my seat. Others were listening now." The cabin was no longer filled with ambient hum. It was focused, unified, something rare. A man in 5A cleared his throat. "I saw it. I didn't say anything earlier, but I saw how it went down. You were already sitting down when the attendant asked you to get up. For that guy back there." He tilted his head slightly toward Derek, and I remember thinking it felt off, but I didn't say anything. "I'm sorry." Quinton didn't reply. Not because he was angry, but because he understood. Silence was easy. Silence was safe. Another woman, this one in 2C, added, "I didn't know what was happening at first, but when I heard you ask why, and she said priority passenger without looking at you, I felt something in my chest, like it wasn't right, but I looked away. I'm sorry, too." Quinton looked up. "You don't need to apologize," he said softly, "but now you're seeing it. That's enough." One by one, the cabin began to shift, not physically, but emotionally. A collective breath, a reckoning. The passengers were no longer passive observers. They were witnesses. Miranda watched them with quiet intensity. This was the moment Quinton had been preparing for, not the scandal, not the shutdown, but the transformation, the turning of people from bystanders into believers. Back in headquarters, Garrett Langston stood at the edge of the boardroom table, face drenched in blue light from the video wall. The national media had caught fire. CNN, MSNBC, Bloomberg. Even morning talk shows were broadcasting side-by-side images, the man in 1A, calmly seated, and the headlines beneath. Black CEO silently halts entire airline after discriminatory incident. Amber Dupree turned to him, face pale. "The board wants to speak directly. They're assembling now. Crisis PR is already drafting an official statement. But they want to know, should we issue an apology?" Langston didn't answer right away. He was staring at the live stream from the aircraft. It was silent, but you could see everything. The faces, the mood, the moment. He sighed. Not just an apology. We're going to need to rethink the way we do everything. He stepped out of frame. Meanwhile, back on Flight 208, a child in row 6 tugged at his mother's sleeve. Is he famous? His mother looked at Quinton, then at her son. No, she said. He's something better. He's right. Quinton looked out the window, letting that moment land. Rightness wasn't always loud. It wasn't always glorified. But when it showed up quiet, steady, unwilling to move, it changed everything. The aircraft lights dimmed again. The flight was still grounded. But for the first time, the passengers weren't anxious. They were aware. Quinton sat back, letting the silence return, not as an absence, but as a presence. It was no longer the hush of fear or erasure. It was the quiet before change. The cabin was quiet again, but the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't the sterile stillness of pre-takeoff checklist procedures anymore. It was the kind of stillness you feel before a verdict is read, before someone tells the truth no one wanted to admit. Quinton Raye sat in 1A, his posture relaxed but grounded in presence. He hadn't moved much in the past hour, not even when the cabin lights flickered or when the flight attendants paced silently, whispering updates into handheld radios. He didn't need to speak. Everyone else was doing that for him now. In row 5, a middle-aged woman in a denim jacket leaned over to her seatmate. I was on that same route last month. Same airline. There was this young black man in first class. They made him show his ID 3 times. The other passenger nodded. Same thing happened to my cousin. Makes you wonder how often this happens when no one's watching. But now they were watching, and Quinton knew the time had come. He unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, not with a flourish, not with anger, just deliberate motion. Heads turned. A child in row 7 craned his neck over the armrest. When Quinton stood, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't even raise his hand. He simply turned to face the cabin. I'd like to say something, he said gently. The silence deepened. Miranda, seated just behind him, gave a small nod, her eyes steady. Quinton stepped into the aisle, facing rows of people who had begun the day as strangers. Now, they were participants in a national moment, witnesses to a rupture in routine. I'm not here to make anyone uncomfortable, he began. I'm not angry. I'm not trying to be dramatic. I just want to tell you why I stayed seated. People leaned in. I bought this seat like anyone else. No favors, no upgrades, no status miles. Just me, a businessman, a traveler, a human being. A woman in 2C clutched her phone, still recording, but now holding it lower, more respectfully. When the attendant asked me to move, Quinton continued, I asked why. I was told it was for a priority passenger, but I didn't see any reason that person's priority mattered more than mine. I didn't see any reason, except the reason we all pretend not to talk about. He paused. I stayed in my seat because I've learned that if I move once, I'll be asked to move again. Not just here, not just on a plane, in boardrooms, on sidewalks, at dinner parties, at the bank, on job applications, in conversation, in history books. Several people nodded. I stayed because I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't move. He smiled softly. Now we all know. The moment hung in the air like a weightless stone. No applause, just reverence. Tricia, the lead flight attendant, had stopped mid-step. Her eyes were wide and wet, She didn't say a word, but her hand slowly lowered the radio from her mouth. Quinton continued. I didn't want to cause a scene. That's not who I am. But I also didn't want to pretend it didn't matter. He exhaled. I've worked with airlines. I've built systems to make them safer. I've read the policies. I've seen the metrics. He looked around the plane, and I know that in those metrics, people like me don't show up as names. We show up as deviations, as exceptions, as outliers. He let that land. I'm not an outlier. I'm a person. The silence remained, but now it was warm, reflective, a quiet echo of realization blooming through the cabin. I didn't plan this, Quinton said, looking toward Miranda, but I also didn't walk away from it. He stepped back toward his seat, his voice now softer, almost like a prayer. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it just refuses to move. He sat down, and no one said a word, not because they didn't want to, but because the truth didn't need a response. It needed time. Miranda leaned forward. You okay? Quinton gave the faintest nod. Yeah, I'm just tired. Not physically, just tired of having to explain what should be obvious. She placed her hand briefly on his shoulder. I know. In the back of the plane, Derek Voss had shrunk into his seat. The phone clutched in his lap, unread notifications piling up. His usual defense, his charm, his class, his money. None of it shielded him now. He stared ahead, mouth drawn tight, as if trying to calculate an apology, a justification, anything. But no words came, because the moment didn't belong to him anymore. At Virion headquarters, board members had now convened via emergency link. Legal teams were prepping for multiple investigations. Crisis PR was working through the night, and Garrett Langston, the COO, was pacing like a man who knew the tide had already turned against him. He spoke, Amber said, holding up her phone. It's everywhere. Over 6 million views in 2 hours. And the tone. Langston looked up. It's not just outrage, she said. It's respect. The public is siding with him, not just because of what happened, but because of how he handled it. Langston ran a hand down his face. What do we do? Amber hesitated, then offered a truth most executives fear. You listen, and you change. Back on the plane. The mood had shifted completely. The anxiety had melted into quiet admiration. The hush wasn't discomfort. Now it was reverence. Tricia approached again, slower this time. Her eyes were rimmed red, voice quieter than ever. I don't have words, but I see it now. I see you. I'm sorry I didn't earlier. Quinton gave a gentle nod. I appreciate that. And whatever happens, she added, I hope you know you changed something here. He glanced around the cabin. I didn't change anything, he said. I just stopped pretending it couldn't be changed. A single phone call can change a course of history. And at 7:52 p.m. Eastern Time, that call came in. The Virion Control Tower at Marston International received the override from the FAA's Silent Protocol Office, a rarely used authority only triggered when legal, ethical, and operational violations threaten national civil air safety or public trust. What made it unprecedented this time was who requested it. It wasn't filed through legal. It wasn't initiated by a lawyer. It came directly from Quinton Raye, through a secure executive override known by very few and understood by fewer. The call went like this. This is Quinton Raye, Sentinel ID 146B, initiate Sky Freeze Level 2, confirm authorization via Centrac Protocol. I am on board Flight 228. Situation has met escalation criteria. Confirm compliance. Effective immediately. The response came quickly. No debate. No hesitation. Mr. Raye, authorization received. Sky freeze level 2 acknowledged. Ground order being relayed to all hubs. We will comply. Godspeed, sir. And just like that, the sky bent. In a matter of minutes, all Virion flights still on the ground were instructed to hold position. Those mid-air were advised to prepare for immediate landing at the nearest approved port. The ripple effect spread like oil on water. Regional air traffic control centers flashed with urgent tags. Virion halt in effect. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It wasn't weather. It wasn't security. It was ethics. The kind that airlines never quite plan for. The kind that doesn't show up on pilot dashboards or fuel manifests but has the power to shake corporate towers. On Flight 228, Tricia received the news in the galley from the co-pilot directly. She stumbled back into the aisle, pale and breathless. They're grounding all flights, she said aloud. Every Virion flight, all across the country. The words didn't seem real at first, but the murmurs in the cabin turned into gas, then into hushed awe. You mean, because of this flight, someone asked. She nodded. Because of this man. Quinton didn't flinch. He'd known the moment would come, but the weight of it still sat heavy in his chest. Miranda whispered. That was the call, yes. And it's done. He gave the faintest nod. No applause erupted. There was no dramatic score, just silence thick and meaningful. Passengers began to sit deeper in their seats, as if the gravity had physically shifted, as if they were suddenly aware they were inside something much larger than aluminum and altitude. They were inside a moment. Derek Voss stood now, his voice trembling. You can't just shut down an entire airline. Quinton looked up at him calmly. I didn't shut it down. I stopped it. There's a difference. You don't have that kind of power, Derek insisted. But even as he said it, his voice wilted under the weight of his own doubt. Quinton turned slightly in his seat. You'd be surprised what kind of power silence can hold. Derek stepped back. At Virion headquarters in Chicago, chaos bloomed behind closed doors. Conference rooms lit with urgent red banners. Crisis council with eyes wide and jaws tight. The board demanded a unified response, but there was none to be found. Garrett Langston paced the 38th floor like a man on the edge of ruin. Across from him, Amber Dupree stared at the alert from the FAO. Every gate's frozen. Our call centers are overwhelmed. We're on the front page of every outlet, every news ticker. Our stock halted trading. Garrett, this is a code black swan. We need to get ahead of this, he said, but even he sounded unsure. Amber held up her phone. You're not ahead. He's 3 moves ahead. On the screen was a live stream. Quinton, seated in 1A. Silent, Amber added. Do you know what people are calling him? Garrett shook his head. The Sky Whisperer. Back on the plane. Tricia approached once more. I spoke to the captain, she said, voice cracking slightly. He said this is now under FAA oversight. They're sending someone to the jet bridge to speak to you directly. Quinton remained calm. Good. The passengers watched, not with fear, but with anticipation. Even the skeptical ones, those who had first rolled their eyes or looked away, now saw something they couldn't unsee. Integrity. Not shouted, not posted, but lived. The door to the cockpit opened, and Captain Reardon stepped out. He was older, with silver at his temples and lines of weathered experience under his eyes. He walked the aisle like a man choosing every step. Stopping in front of Quinton, he gave a slow, respectful nod. I just want to say, the captain began, that I've flown 28 years, military, commercial, cargo. I've seen turbulence, fire, hail, mid-air emergencies, but I've never seen a moment like this." Quinton looked up at him. "It's not about me," he said. "No, sir," the captain replied. "But you reminded us what flying was supposed to mean." He extended his hand. Quinton took it. The handshake was brief, but it said everything. Across the cabin, someone quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Another person pressed pause on their recording. For the first time, they weren't watching for proof. They were watching for meaning. A small voice came from the middle of the plane. A child. Again. "Mom, is the plane broken?" The mother leaned in, smiled. "No, baby, it's waking up." And then the jet bridge connected. A uniformed FAA official stepped into the plane. A woman in a gray suit with quiet confidence and sharp eyes. She spoke directly to Quinton. "Mr. Raye, may I have a word outside the cabin?" Quinton stood, adjusted his jacket. The cabin followed him with their gaze, every movement recorded in memory. He walked toward the front of the plane, each step like a heartbeat, not rushed, not delayed, just right. At the threshold of the aircraft, he turned around. To every single passenger, he offered a gentle bow of the head. "Thank you," it said, "for watching, for learning, for seeing." Then he stepped into the jet bridge, and the door slowly closed behind him. The fluorescent lights inside the private terminal meeting room buzzed faintly, casting a muted glow over the sleek oak table and minimalist decor. Outside the glass windows, the rest of the airport sat in limbo-grounded flights, rerouted passengers, a silence hovering over the tarmac that mirrored the unease in the room. Quinton Raye entered without ceremony. No entourage, no announcement, just him, dressed in the same navy travel jacket and black slacks. He carried no briefcase, no documents. The silence in his steps carried more power than any corporate badge or press release. Waiting at the table were the people who thought they ran the sky. Garrett Langston, COO of Virion Air, Elena Marcus, Chief Counsel, Reese Hanford, Head of Strategic Partnerships, and a few others observers, assistants, nervous silence wearing masks. They had flown in on a red-eye to handle what the media was now calling the 1A standstill. They had expected to meet a man angry, perhaps reactive, someone they could outmaneuver with words or deflect with polished apologies. What they met instead was presence. Quinton took the seat at the head of the table, not because he asked, but because no one else dared. Langston was the first to speak. His voice was strained from long hours, but still dipped in habitual authority. "Mr. Raye, thank you for agreeing to meet. We want to begin by acknowledging that what happened on board Flight 228 should never have happened." Quinton said nothing. Langston continued, "We're conducting a full internal review. We've suspended all implicated staff for the time being, and we've issued a statement of regret." Quinton lifted a single finger, calm, firm. "No." Langston blinked. "No. No more statements. No more internal reviews. No more media-crafted regrets." His voice remained soft, but it cut cleaner than any raised tone. "I didn't come here to listen to damage control. I came to address the root." Elena Marcus adjusted her glasses. "With all due respect, Mr. Raye, we are committed to fairness. What occurred on that flight?" "What occurred on that flight," Quinton interrupted gently, "was not an isolated error. It was a symptom." He looked directly at her. "And you know that." She stiffened. "This isn't about one flight attendant," Quinton said, "or one executive, or one passenger with influence. It's about the structure that made what happened feel normal enough to go unquestioned. Until I didn't move. Reese cleared his throat. Mr. Raye, the sky freeze you initiated while legally within your right under Sentinel authorization has grounded nearly 130 planes. It's created a logistical nightmare for thousands of travelers, and yet, not one of them was forcibly removed from a seat they paid for based on race in the past 3 hours. Quinton replied, "Imagine that." The room fell silent. Garrett leaned forward, folding his hands. "What do you want?" The question was raw, tired, cornered. Quinton exhaled and looked out the window for a brief moment, watching as a ground crew pushed back a silent jet. "What I want is something your policies can't draft, something your legal teams can't redact. I want truth to mean more than branding. I want change that doesn't start with headlines and die in strategy memos." He leaned forward. "I want you to tell the public the truth. Not about me, about yourselves." Reese frowned. "What do you mean I want Vurion to publicly admit that implicit bias, institutional culture, and systemic inequity have shaped its operations? I want a real audit, external, transparent, and led by civil equity leaders outside the aviation sector. I want a binding agreement that ensures frontline staff are trained not just to recite compliance protocols, but to recognize humanity. And I want passengers of every background to be treated with equal presumption of belonging." The room bristled. "You're asking for a complete overhaul of our cultural framework," Elena said quietly. "I'm asking for the dignity that should have already existed," Quinton answered. "You just happened to be the first to be held accountable on camera." Langston leaned back in his chair. For the first time, his face changed. Less defensiveness, more exhaustion, maybe even recognition. "What happens if we say no?" Quinton met his gaze. "Then I file my full incident report with the FAA and DOT. I release my flight data logs, the onboard communications recordings, the internal documents I have access to from prior contracts. And I spend every day for the next 6 months making sure the public understands what happens behind the curtain of an airline built on selective hospitality." A pause. Then Quinton added with quiet steel, "And I don't stop." There it was. Not a threat. A promise. Langston rubbed his temples. "You're serious." "I've been serious since they asked me to move." For a long moment, no one spoke. Outside, the sun had started to rise, casting a faint golden hue over the terminal roof. The first sign that something new was beginning. Elena finally asked, Why not take the settlement and walk away like so many others?" Quinton sat back. "My grandfather helped lay concrete on airport runways in the South during a time he couldn't even fly on the planes he built. My mother worked the night shift in dispatch to put me through school. And I've spent my life consulting for companies like this one cleaning messes created by people who think optics are the same thing as justice." He glanced around the table. "So I stayed in my seat. And I stayed in the fight. Because too many people before me didn't have the choice." A long silence followed. Then Garrett Langston, to the shock of his team, slowly stood. He looked at Quinton not as a CEO, not as a threat, but as a man who had confronted him with something no quarterly report ever had. Truth. He extended his hand. "Let's draft what you asked. Let's get it right." Quinton rose and shook it, not with triumph, but with purpose. And in that moment, the old power dynamic dissolved. This wasn't about saving a brand. It was about rebuilding a sky. The engines had long since powered down. The aircraft stood idle at gate C-27 with his once-packed cabin now reduced to a soft murmur of voices, hushed movements, and the occasional metallic rattle of a drink cart being returned to its dock. Most of the passengers had remained on board, not out of necessity, but out of a collective sense that they were witnessing something bigger than travel. The atmosphere wasn't tense anymore. It was reverent, as if they had stepped into history without realizing it until too late. In seat 11C, near the emergency exit row, an older black woman sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. Her coat, a worn houndstooth pattern with frayed seams, clashed with the modern textures of first-class and designer bags. She'd said little the entire flight. No phone out, no comments, just eyes steady and watchful. Now, she pressed the call button above her head. A soft chime rang. Tricia Coleman approached with cautious energy, her movements more careful than before. This flight had transformed her, too, though she was still piecing together who she would become on the other side of it. "Yes, ma'am," she said, voice quieter than usual. The woman looked up, her eyes gentle. "I need to speak to Mr. Raye." Tricia hesitated. "He's still speaking with the FAA and Virion executives. Then I'll wait," the woman said. "But he'll want to hear what I have to say." Her voice was calm, confident, and somehow familiar. Tricia nodded and stepped away. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. And finally, the door at the front of the aircraft hissed open again. Quinton stepped back onto the plane. The air shifted as he did, like a weight returning to the room. He didn't speak as he moved toward the woman in 11C, but something in his expression softened when he saw her. He stopped beside her seat. "Ma'am," he said respectfully. "Sit with me," she replied. Quinton slid into the open aisle seat. She gave him a long look, not of admiration, but of recognition. "You don't remember me," she said, "but I remember you." He blinked. "My name's Ruth Darby. I worked for your mother when you were just a boy." Quinton's breath caught in his throat. "She used to bring you by the dispatch center on the weekends. When childcare fell through, you'd sit on the floor with crayons while she managed the chaos of late-night logistics. She used to say, 'That one's going to grow up and fix everything that's broken in the sky.'" His voice cracked slightly. "You worked nights at Pacific Freight Line?" "Yes," she said, "for 27 years. And I've been watching this flight, this moment, unfold with a heart full of fire and a mind full of memory." Quinton looked down at his hands. "I never thought I'd meet someone from that part of my life again. Not like this." "I didn't either," she admitted. "But I need to tell you something. Something I didn't think I had the courage to say until now." He looked up. "I was on the committee that helped draft the early passenger treatment guidelines for Virion. Not recently, years ago. Back when they were still just a regional connector. We submitted dozens of proposals on equity, dignity, implicit bias screening. We warned them about microaggressions and gatekeeping from the start. You know what they did." He shook his head. "They shelved it, watered it down, filed it under non-critical culture enhancements. They said it was too idealistic, too complicated, too sensitive." Quinton closed his eyes for a beat, and I let it go. She continued. "I told myself I had done what I could. I took the small wins, the bathroom signage updates, the Spanish language pamphlets, but the big stuff, the real structural change, I let them ignore it." He turned to her. "That's not on you. It's on all of us," Ruth said softly. "And I watched you, today, do something I didn't have the power or maybe the courage to do back then. You didn't just stay in your seat. You held up a mirror." Quinton's voice lowered. "I wasn't sure if anyone really saw it. Beyond the cameras." She placed her hand over his. "I saw it, and so did every young kid who's ever been told they were too loud, too much, or didn't belong in the nice seats. You reminded them that we are not guests on these flights. We are part of the sky, Silence. It was more than a compliment. It was a passing of something sacred, a legacy not written in ink but carved in shared experience. Ruth sat back. Her voice grew even softer. There's a moment, Quinton, when you stop asking to be seen and you start making them look. That moment changes the world just a little, but it's enough. He swallowed hard. Thank you, he said. The words weighted and real. Ruth smiled. Now go finish what you started. He stood, nodded, and turned toward the front of the cabin once more. As he passed the other passengers, their expressions changed. One by one, they began to stand, silently, without being asked, as if acknowledging not just him, but what he represented. In that moment, Quinton wasn't a CEO. He was a bridge. Tricia waited near the galley, tears barely held back. You okay? He asked. She nodded slowly. I think I'm beginning to understand what I've been part of and what I have to answer for. Quinton gave a soft nod. We all do. Do you think I can change? She asked, voice cracking. He paused, then placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Yes, he said simply, but it has to start from here. He tapped his own chest, not from a manual. She exhaled shakily. Then I want to try. Then start by listening. He walked past her, leaving her with the echo of that truth. Outside the aircraft, the sky had shifted. Planes sat quietly on runways across the nation. But something deeper was moving beneath the surface. Something far more powerful than jets. The conference room overlooking runway 4 was no longer filled with corporate bravado or sanitized apologies. After hours of tense negotiation, the air had shifted less legal maneuvering, more listening. Garrett Langston leaned forward, arms resting heavily on the table. Across from him sat Quinton Raye, calm and unmoved, the same quiet strength in his eyes that he had shown in seat 1A hours before. On the walls, flight maps flickered on digital panels, now frozen with grounded paths. I've reviewed everything you've submitted, Garrett said. The list of reforms, the external audit requirements, the public apology terms, the employee recertification protocols. It's massive, but it's doable. Quinton didn't speak. But I know there's more, Garrett added, his voice subdued. You said you had one final condition? Quinton nodded once. This last demand, he said quietly, is not about me. It's about legacy. Miranda Cho, seated to Garrett's right, raised an eyebrow. Legacy. Quinton folded his hands. Ver and Air will establish a permanent, independently governed passenger equity board, comprised of legal experts, civil rights leaders, former passengers, airline staff, and trauma counselors. It will not report to the board of directors. It will report directly to the public. Elena Marcus, the chief legal counsel, blinked. You want a civilian oversight body for an airline? Yes, Quinton replied. With binding power over discrimination claims, incident reviews, hiring transparency, and flight crew behavioral assessments. Reese, who had remained mostly quiet, leaned back in disbelief. That's not oversight. That's external governance. You're asking us to surrender internal control. No, Quinton replied calmly. I'm asking you to earn public trust again. You lost it, and you don't get to take it back by tweaking language on a website. You get it back when you're brave enough to be watched. Garrett rubbed the bridge of his nose. Quinton, this sets a precedent that other airlines will never accept. Then let Virion be the first, Quinton said, because someone has to break the pattern. A heavy silence filled the room. Outside, the sun had climbed halfway up the sky. The grounded jets glinted with light, motionless but waiting, like something bigger than metal and fuel might finally lift them again. Garrett glanced at Miranda, then at Elena, then at Quinton. What if we say no? Then the flight freeze holds, Quinton answered. The Sentinel records become public. The media will get the crew transcripts, passenger footage, time-stamped communications. I will not spin it. I will release it. And the public will decide what kind of airline you are. He leaned forward. And I promise you this, whatever money you lose in a freeze will be nothing compared to what you lose when mothers stop buying tickets for their children to fly alone. When professionals like me book every other airline except yours. When your brand becomes a warning instead of a welcome. Miranda Cho finally spoke. You could have done this quietly, taken a settlement, rebuilt from the shadows. Why go public with everything? Why burn it down? I'm not burning it down, Quinton replied, voice still soft. I'm planting something new, and yes, it starts in the ashes. Elena leaned back. You're asking for systemic humility. That doesn't come naturally to this industry. Neither did justice, Quinton said. But someone, somewhere, has to insist on it anyway. Garrett stood, slowly. He walked to the window, watching a toddler in the distance press his hands against the terminal glass, eyes wide at the sight of jets frozen in time. I've been in this industry for 30 years, he said without turning. I know every excuse, every deflection. I've signed off on policies that sounded good in press releases and changed nothing in practice. I thought if we could keep the planes flying, everything else would sort itself out. He turned. I was wrong. The others looked at him, surprised. Garrett returned to the table. If we're going to be the first, then we do it all the way. He looked directly at Quinton. We'll establish the board. Full oversight, public reporting, binding authority on discrimination-related claims. Helena raised a hand. Garrett, that's a legal minefield. We'll be exposed. No more hiding, he said. We've already been exposed. Now we choose what to do with it. Miranda stared at him, then slowly nodded. Quinton remained still, but something in his posture shifted. Not victory, but alignment. Reese sighed. We'll be the only airline in the world with this kind of structure. You realize that, right? Yes, Quinton replied, and people will remember you for it. Garrett held out his hand. Quinton took it. The grip was firm, historic, back on the aircraft. Passengers watched from their windows as a row of airport police officers slowly filed away. No conflict, no announcement, just a quiet departure. Ruth Darby, still seated in 11C, smiled softly and whispered under her breath, It's beginning. At the front of the plane, Tricia stood beside the door, eyes misted. Quinton stepped back on board. His gaze swept the cabin, then settled on her. I'm not the same woman who stepped onto this flight, she said quietly. None of us are, he replied. She paused. I have a long way to go. We all do, Quinton said. But some journeys don't begin until we've been grounded. Passengers stood, slowly, one by one, not in protest, in witness. As Quinton walked down the aisle, dozens of phones stayed in pockets. No one was filming now. This moment wasn't for social media. It was for memory and movement. He reached seat 1A, sat down, not because he had fought for it, but because it was his, because it always had been. 3 days later, the world was still watching. Every major news outlet from CNN to Al Jazeera carried the footage, not of shouting matches or viral takedowns, but of stillness, silence, The shot of a single man in a tailored Navy suit walking down the aisle of a motionless aircraft had become an emblem, not of power, but of presence, of refusal, of reclaiming. And when Quinton Raye's voice had finally been broadcast, speaking not as a victim, but as a steward of dignity, millions leaned in. It wasn't about revenge, it was about repair. At Virian's press conference in Atlanta, Garrett Langston stepped forward to the podium, a folder in his hand and truth in his voice. He looked out across the press corps, cameras rolling, lights flaring, microphones clustered like eager questions. "I've worked in aviation for 3 decades," he began, eyes heavy, "and never once have I seen an industry brought to a halt not by weather, not by labor strikes, not by mechanical failures, but by conscience." A long pause. 3 days ago, one of our own, Mr. Quinton Raye, was publicly humiliated, dismissed from his seat, and made to justify his presence. That act, and the system that allowed it, is not only unacceptable, it's over. Flashes popped. We are implementing immediate, permanent changes. Beginning today, Virion Airlines will be the first commercial carrier in the world to install an independent passenger equity board with full oversight powers. He read off the rest of the reform commitments: bias training, employment transparency, anonymous reporting systems, and perhaps most importantly, automatic review of any flight incident flagged for racial, gender, or disability-based discrimination. He closed the folder and looked directly into the lens. "To every passenger who has ever been made to feel like a threat instead of a guest, we see you. And this time, we're not asking for your trust. We're earning it." The press room erupted in questions, but Garrett stepped back, because that was the last moment this story would belong to the executives. From here forward, it belonged to the people. In Boston, a mother rebooked her daughter's solo flight for the first time in 3 years. Because now, she told the check-in clerk, "I believe someone will protect her in the sky, in Oakland." An 11-year-old boy watched Quinton's interview replay on YouTube. He turned to his grandmother and whispered, "He looks like me, in Chicago." A group of airline employees passed around copies of the new passenger equity guidelines like a sacred text. Some read it with curiosity, others with tears. In Nairobi, Seoul, Toronto, Sydney, pilots, flight attendants, and gate agents began asking their own questions. If Virion could change, what about them? The story didn't stay confined to terminals and control towers. It spread into boardrooms, classrooms, community halls. It wasn't just about airlines anymore. It was about belonging. It was about the subtle violence of assumption. It was about who gets believed, who gets seated, who gets asked to explain themselves, and who floats above accountability. Quinton sat at a cafe in Atlanta's West End. 2 days after the press conference, no bodyguards, no press agent, just him, a ceramic mug of black coffee, and the warmth of the morning sun cutting across his shoulders. A young man approached, nervous, clutching a messenger bag. "Mr. Raye." Quinton looked up, offered a soft smile. "I just wanted to say thank you," the man said, "for what you did. My mother cried when she saw the footage. She's been flying for 40 years and never once felt like she had the right to speak up when something went wrong." Quinton nodded. "It's not just about one seat. I know. It's about all of them." They shook hands. The man left. Quinton sipped his coffee, heart full of quiet ache and quiet pride. He didn't want celebrity. He wanted change. And it was beginning. Tricia Coleman stood in front of a classroom inside Virion's Atlanta Training Center. She wore the same uniform, but something had shifted. In her stance, in her eyes. She faced a room full of new hires. Before you memorize the evacuation protocols, she began, I want to talk about something else. The room stilled. I made a mistake on Flight 283. A mistake rooted not just in policy, but in perception. I assumed things I had no right to assume. I dismissed someone I had no right to dismiss. I embarrassed a man who didn't deserve it. Her voice cracked. She let it. But instead of disappearing, he taught us all how to see again. She paused. If you remember anything from this training, let it be this: your job is not to control people. It's to protect their dignity, even when it's inconvenient, even when it means standing alone. Silence, then applause. From the back row, Ruth Darby sat with a clipboard, quietly smiling, watching the torch pass. That night, Quinton stood on his apartment balcony, eyes fixed on the glowing trails of jets overhead. He remembered the boy he once was, sitting cross-legged in a dispatch center on a Saturday night, coloring with crayons on a cement floor while his mother rerouted freight across the nation. He remembered the smell of burnt coffee, the hum of fax machines, the way she'd whisper when she thought he was asleep, I hope he never has to prove he belongs in the sky. He hadn't. Until now. But maybe that fight would make it easier for the next boy. Maybe he'd never even noticed the ceiling that had once existed. Maybe he'd just walk through it like it had never been there, because someone had already broken it, and left the cracks behind as proof. Epilogue. 2 months later, Viren Airlines unveiled a new motto at their terminals. The sky belongs to everyone. It wasn't just paint on a wall. It was policy. It was accountability. It was visible, not just in words, but in action. Passengers began noticing little changes, more diverse crews, more patient interactions, apologies that actually meant something. But most of all, they noticed the feeling that no one glanced twice when a black man took a seat in first class, that no child was scolded for asking questions in a language unfamiliar to the crew, that dignity no longer required proof. It was offered at the gate, just like a boarding pass, just like belonging. He never raised his voice. He never demanded vengeance. He simply demanded truth. And in doing so, Quinton Raye didn't just reclaim his seat. He reclaimed a space where people like him had been questioned, dismissed, and silenced for far too long. This story wasn't about punishing a flight attendant or tearing down an airline. It was about building something better in its place, something that doesn't flinch when passengers look different, speak differently, or sit in first class without explanation. It was about saying, we belong, we always have. And for everyone who's ever been told to prove they're worthy of being seen, heard, and seated, this was justice, finally taking flight. But what about the next time, the next plane, the next child who boards alone? That's why these stories matter. Not just to remember what went wrong, but to make sure it never happens again. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, if it made you feel something deep in your chest, then please like, share, go, and subscribe. Your voice is part of this change, and trust us. The stories we're about to tell next will stay with you long after the seatbelt sign turns off, because the sky belongs to everyone, but only if we keep fighting for it. See you in the next story.